It's tonight my privilege and my honor to introduce Professor Jennifer Nash to our audience. Since last year, Jennifer Nash is the chair of gender, sexuality, and family studies at Duke University in North Carolina. Previously, she taught as professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Northwestern University, Illinois, and also she taught at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Jennifer's first study was law. She studied law at Harvard Law School, but decided later to change her discipline, and she then did her PhD in African American Studies, also at Harvard University. In her first famed book, which appeared under the title The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography in 2014, a book that won the Ellen Bray Prize for the Modern Language of the Modern Language Association, Jennifer deals with the question how racial fictions can create a space of agency and even pleasure for Black female subjects. Articles like Strange Intimacies, which was published in Public Culture, and like Writing Black Beauty, which appeared in Science, or Pleasurable Blackness, are other titles from her writings on sexual politics and representation, intimacy, and sex wars. Her second book, called Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, appearing in 2019, was the result of many years' engagement with the concept of intersectionality. This book won the Gloria Anzaldúa Prize from the National Women's Association. And in this book, that has been praised as much as it has been harshly criticized, Jennifer Nash argues that with and through the concept intersectionality, Black feminism has been marked by defensiveness. Defensiveness that has led to policing the usage and circulation of the concept, to protectionist intellectual wars about ownership connected with the question, to whom does the concept belong and to whom it doesn't belong. The critiques, Jennifer critiques the proprietary impulse, as she calls it, of some Black feminists, and instead advocates a theory of intersectionality which is generous and inspired by vulnerability, intimacy, transnationalism, and ethics of witnessing. She argues that intersectionality's popularity has begun to limit Black feminist possibilities. Before this book appeared, she had already written path-breaking articles on intersectionality, such as Intersectionality and Its Discontents, which was published in American Quarterly, or Rethinking Intersectionality, which appeared in Feminist Review. These articles paved the way to the book, articles that have become very influential in the international intersectionality debate. And I must admit they are compulsory readings in my classes. Her new book, on which she worked during her fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies in the year 2019-20, will appear very soon, also with Duke, I think. It is titled Birthing Black Mothers, and deals with Black motherhood in the Black Lives Matter era. For this book, she interviewed Black women working as doulas, a word that is not well known in Germany. I would translate it as non-medical midwives. In this book, Jennifer rethinks Black maternal politics, racial and gender politics, for instance, breastfeeding, and she analyzes the Black maternal body as a vessel of Black lives. In an interview at her new hub in North Carolina, Jennifer says that she is very passionate about her work. I quote, "I'm committed to Black feminism as a theoretical and political project. That's where my heart lies." End of quote. With her writings on the intersectionality battles, Jennifer has inspired the title of our lecture series, Intersectionality in a Crossfire, of which Jennifer is now the final speaker. In her lecture tonight, called The Institutional Life of Intersectionality, Jennifer endeavors, I quote, to understand a moment when intersectionality has become institutionalized, is conflated with diversity and deployed by universities and women's studies departments and programs to signal commitments to inclusion and difference. How and why did intersectionality come to institutional power in the early 2000s? And what institutional needs in women's studies and in the university more broadly did intersectionality's emergence serve? Jennifer, we are looking forward to a passionate talk, and I promise we will be passionate listeners.
Thank you, Helma. That's such a generous introduction. I really appreciate it. I wish I could be there with you all, but this is the next best thing. So it's a tremendous honor to be here. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction that sort of, I hope, encapsulates the project of my book more broadly, and then I'm going to delve into some of the more specific questions that Helma articulated. In an article published in the New Yorker magazine in 2016, Nathan Heller described intersectionality as the heart of contemporary student activism. He writes, quote, "If the new campus activism has a central paradigm, it is intersectionality, a theory originating in Black feminism that sees identity-based oppression operating in cross-hatching ways." A year later, journalist Andrew Sullivan's polemic against intersectionality was published in New York magazine. He described intersectionality as, quote, "the latest academic craze sweeping the American academy," and likened it to, in his words, a religion that produces a dangerous orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained and through which all speech must be filtered. Both articles were largely condemned for representing students as hypersensitive and coddled, and for trafficking in deep misunderstandings of intersectionality's histories, critical and political aspirations, and roots in Black feminist history. Yet what interests me about the articles and the vociferous responses to them by scholars and activists on the US left is how intersectionality acted as the window through which to view either the imagined problems or the imagined progress of the contemporary university. In some ways, it's unsurprising that a term rooted in Black women's intellectual production would be figured as a dangerous space of political excess, as an ideology that has colonized the hearts and minds of vulnerable college students, as this is precisely how Black women's corporeal presences have been endlessly figured. Yet what is new and even surprising is the contention that intersectionality is at the center of the university's intellectual and political life, that an understanding of the contemporary university requires contending with intersectionality. So my second book, Black Feminism Reimagined, is a project that carefully studies intersectionality's lives in the US university. The project was born from a deep curiosity about the variety of political and theoretical work that intersectionality is called upon to perform in the US Academy, and in the peculiarly contentious battles that have been waged around intersectionality. Battles which I argue implicate the body that haunts the analytic Black woman, even if she is not always explicitly named as such. If intersectionality functions as a barometer measuring and calibrating the political atmosphere of the US university, I argue that it has been most emphatically called upon to perform corrective ecological work in the context of women's studies, and that it is in relationship to academic feminism that intersectionality's institutional life has taken shape. Indeed, in the book, I treat intersectionality as women's studies primary program building initiative, as its institutional and ethical orientation, even as the field retains an ambivalent relationship with the analytic, always imagining it as simultaneously promising and dangerous, as the field's utopic future and its past tense. And I will say, and we can talk more about this in Q&A, I think there is a way in which what I'm mapping in the context of the US Academy plays out in larger conversations in the US left outside of the Academy. And that I think was particularly and most acutely the case during the Trump presidency. More than that, because women's studies has been a kind of laboratory for intersectionality's institutional life in the US Academy, understanding feminist conversations about intersectionality as the remedy, the cure, the threat, or the peril enables an understanding of the debates that swirl around intersectionality in the university at large. Black Feminism Reimagined explores in particular what it has meant for Black feminism and Black feminists to have intersectionality come to occupy the center of women's studies and to migrate across disciplinary boundaries, to be both filled with promise and emptied of specific meaning. I ask how Black feminists have made visible their collective feelings about what Robin Wiegman calls intersectionality's citational ubiquity in and beyond women's studies, and about the Black feminist affects that attend to the variety of hopes and perils that have been imaginatively tethered to the analytic. And in particular, I argue that there is a single affect that has come to mark contemporary academic Black feminist practice, which I call defensiveness. So I want to illustrate defensiveness through a story. And for folks who have read the book, I have a sort of ethnographer's preoccupation with stories about academic conferences, but I think they're fascinating sites where we communicate with each other what is valued or devalued in the field, often in ways that are not explicit. And I think Tiffany Lethabo-King has a beautiful article on feminist formations that thinks through how graduate students are socialized into professional knowledge through code words like so-and-so's work is rigorous or lacks nuance. And so I wanted to think about how conferences become spaces through which we confer meaning on and value on particular ideas. So I'm going to illustrate defensiveness through a story. I'm part of a panel at a small conference with a few other Black feminist scholars, all of whom work on intersectionality. The mood is tense as we discuss the racial politics of intersectionality circulation, its movement across the humanities and social sciences, and its status as women's studies signature analytic. One scholar remarks that intersectionality's ubiquity reminds her of a passage from Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. And that quote, which is from a longer poem, is somebody almost walked off with all of my stuff. The audience roars in delight. And I find myself fascinated both by the deployment of Shange's image of theft and by the audience's enthusiasm. In fact, my project was born of questions that emerged that day. Why had the idea of intersectionality as something stolen resonated so deeply? How might we understand the racial politics of this scene, one where canonical Black feminist work is used to theorize the violent theft of another canonical Black feminist work? Who owns intersectionality and who steals it? And what might this encounter, the use of Shange and the audience's reaction to it, reveal about the affects of contemporary US Black feminisms? What does it mean when an anti-captivity project like Black feminist theory claims ownership as a primary model for conducting Black feminist inquiry? I treat this scene as a point of departure to capture what I argue is a distinctively contemporary academic Black feminist affect, defensiveness. I treat defensiveness as manifested most explicitly through Black feminism's proprietary attachments to intersectionality. These attachments can script Black feminism into a largely protective posture, leaving Black feminists mired in policing intersectionality's usages, demanding that intersectionality remain located within Black feminism, and reasserting intersectionality's true origins in Black feminist texts. My book traces how defensiveness is largely articulated by rendering intersectionality Black feminist property as terrain that has been gentrified, colonized, and appropriated, and I'll say more about those terms later, and as territory that must be guarded and protected through the requisite Black feminist vigilance, care, and stewardship. Stewardship is political scientist Ange-Marie Hancock's term in relationship to intersectionality. In treating defensiveness as a defining Black feminist affect, my intention is not to diagnose individual Black feminists as defensive or to pathologize Black feminist feelings, nor is my impulse to ignore histories of anti-Blackness and misogyny, including the invisible labor of Black women inside the academy that quite literally kills Black female academics. All of this renders Black feminist defensiveness a political response to ongoing violence. I seek to ethically attend to that history, even as I critique the proprietary impulses of Black feminism in an effort to reveal how the defensive affect traps Black feminism, hindering its visionary world-making capacities. The project of my book then theorizes defensiveness as the feeling that emerges when intersectionality is thought to be lost, is thought to be a lost object, or worse, a stolen object. And my book seeks to encourage and imagine other ways of feeling Black feminist, other ways of being Black feminist, and doing Black feminist labor in the academy that eschew defensiveness and its toxicity. So it's sort of, in some ways, a manifesto, a kind of broad overview of the commitments of the book. And what I want to do for the rest of my time today is to sort of think about questions of the institutional life of intersectionality by spending time with another term that we, in the US Academy at least, use often and often without specificity, which is critic. And I want to spend some time with that term in relationship to intersectionality as a way of cracking open the kind of institutional life of this term. So I discovered something about myself when reading a recently published edited volume. I am, in the words of the editor, a vocal critic of intersectionality. To be hailed as one of intersectionality's critics is to inhabit deeply uncomfortable terrain. Jasbir writes that, quote, "The claim to intersectionality as the dominant feminist method can be produced with such insistence that an interest in exploring other frames gets rendered as problematic, and even produces women of color feminists invested in other genealogies as race traders." My impulse then was to understand vocal critic as much more than an intellectual critique. I understood it and even felt it as an allegation, challenging my political commitments to the project of Black feminism. And so my desire was to defend myself from these charges, to insist on my admiration for intersectionality. This talk aspires to suspend that desire, even as I'm deeply intrigued by it. I ask, what are the intellectual and political conditions that permitted me to understand the word critic as an allegation? Why has the term critic, in the context of robust scholarly debate about intersectionality, taken on such a powerful charge? Rather than resist the term or refuse its interpolation, I follow the word critic around the Black feminist theoretical archive, endeavoring to carefully trace to whom it attaches and what makes that attachment possible. In so doing, this talk asserts that Black feminist theorists emphatically retell a singular story about intersectionality, and it goes something like this. Intersectionality is the subject of vicious and inaccurate attacks. It is the victim of an intense backlash, and backlash is Vivian May's term, marked by, as she argues, a remarkable degree of epistemic intolerance. In this account, one group of scholars supports intersectionality, Black feminists, and another powerful chorus of scholars is opposed to intersectionality, the critics. This is, of course, a deeply compelling narrative. It has a victim and a villain and a moral imperative. Intersectionality must be saved, and Black feminists must defend intersectionality from these unwarranted and misguided attacks. This affectively saturated narrative has come to animate the intersectionality wars, a term I'll say more about in a second, the contentious battles that swirl around intersectionality, and that garner their urgency and ethical legitimacy from attempts to protect intersectionality from the world-ending figure of the critic. Yet, as I argue in this talk, this compelling narrative is the site of various projections and fantasies. A close engagement with Black feminist citational practices reveals that intersectionality's critic, always constructed by Black feminism as outside of Black feminism's critical and ethical reach, is actually imaginatively produced by Black feminists as they are locked into practices of holding on to intersectionality. In treating the critic as an imaginative projection, I'm careful not to argue that Black feminists are engaged in dreaming up something that is not there. Instead, I consider how women's studies positioning of Black feminists as disciplinarians who demand that the field offer an account of Black women actually gets performed by Black feminists as they contend with intersectionality's movements to the field's center by guarding intersectionality from the phantasm of the critic. The constant invocation of the malicious critic as a pernicious outsider becomes a crucial rhetorical strategy through which Black feminists reassert their territorial claim to intersectionality and perform their collective desire to shield intersectionality from criticism. So I'll say a little bit about the term intersectionality wars, and then I'll argue that these wars unfold in three ways or around three key ideas. One is around the question of origin, or where intersectionality comes from. The second is around appropriation, and then the third is around this figure of the critic. So the intersectionality wars, again, a story about a conference. At the 2014 American Studies Association conference, a panel entitled "Kill This Keyword" asked, what kind of work do the commonplace keywords of current American studies endeavors do? Panel members were invited to reflect on widely circulating scholarly terms like precarity or neoliberalism or affect, and to determine if these terms should be killed, which is to say banished from our scholarly lexicon, or saved. Nothing generated more anxiety than intersectionality, which was immediately declared dead. Moments after a collective performance of intersectional fatigue, one scholar voiced discomfort with, in his words, killing intersectionality, because to do that would be to kill Black feminism, or perhaps even to kill Black women as objects of study. The room grew quiet at the prospect of symbolically killed Black women. And as intersectionality slipped into Black feminism, slipped into Black woman, the analytic moved from dangerous to desirable, from peril to promise, and the audience that had been quick to kill had been convinced to rescue. In the book, I developed the term intersectionality wars to describe the political and theoretical battle staged in this scene. Indeed, as the small conference vignette makes visible, debates about intersectionality all too quickly become referendums on whether scholars are for or against the term itself. And debates about whether one is for or against intersectionality almost always seem to become questions about whether one is for or against Black feminism, or for or against Black women. And we could ask ourselves what it means to be for or against Black women, but that's a larger question. These slippages between Black women and Black feminism, between intersectionality and Black women, between intersectionality and Black feminism, animate the intersectionality wars, because they ensure that discussing intersectionality's critical limits is always already to debate racial politics and allegiances. Undergirding this scene, this conference scene, and the intersectionality wars more broadly are the affective dimensions of the prevailing narrative I described earlier. One where intersectionality is under siege and must be saved. One where a group of critics, who are characterized in various ways, ranging from misguided careerists to anti-Black, have made it a mission to undermine Black feminist intellectual contributions. I'm of course drawn to the term intersectionality wars because of its echoes with feminism's other wars, perhaps most notably the sex wars. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But if the sex wars were rooted in the sexual culture and sexual panics of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the intersectionality wars that I trace in this book are relatively recent battles, rooted in intersectionality's citational ubiquity, its movement across disciplinary borders, across administrative intellectual boundaries, and across academic popular boundaries. And so I'll just say, to drop a footnote, like in the US, it's common that every 5 years a university will announce its new strategic plan. And in 2 of the 3 universities where I've worked, the provost and the president have announced that intersectionality is a new key pillar of institutional life. And so I always find myself fascinated by how this term comes to be a kind of administrative or even bureaucratic, speak, in the same way that I'm really interested in how intersectionality is one of the few terms, at least in US political life, that moves between the academy and popular culture with ease, right? So I date the intersectionality wars to intersectionality's institutionalization, to the rise of Kimberly Crenshaw's articles mapping the margins and demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex to near canonical status, and to the movement of intersectionality to the center of the field of women's studies. I also date it to intersectionality's circulation in popular feminist conversations as a way of signaling a critical practice attentive to difference, as a way of disciplining so-called white feminism and white feminists. And there, I should say, all kinds of slippages between white feminism, white feminist, and white woman that we could talk more about later. And I also date intersectionality's sort of rise to the ways in which it's become a strategy for naming ethical practices of feminism, or perhaps it's become a way of naming the only ethical form of feminism. As more scholars have laid claim to intersectionality, as more disciplines have come to value, at least rhetorically, intersectionality, the intersectionality wars have escalated, with Black feminists increasingly stepping into the fray to defend the analytic from imagined misuse and abuse, from improper circulations and devaluations. So if the intersectionality wars are contentious, what precisely is being fought over? And so one site that I want to call our attention to is this question of origin. The intersectionality wars are often waged over competing origin stories that narrate the genesis of intersectionality. I find myself always drawn to the language of the biblical when I talk about how origin stories operate. And so when I talked about the near canonical status of Crenshaw's 2 articles, I think there is a way in which they have come to be treated as sort of sacred texts. And there is, I think, increasingly this push in Black feminism that if we only read those sacred texts better with more faithfulness to the word, we would be able to unleash their true power. And so I really do want to think about how much the language in this kind of debate about origin gestures to the sort of to the holy aspects of Crenshaw in particular. So when I describe origin stories, I capture how Black feminism often tethers intersectionality to a singular, coherent, legible origin, describing a particular moment of intersectionality's creation. Origin stories work by presuming that intersectionality emerged not through debate or collaboration, but through a singular voice, moment, or text. And so in this way, we can think about how origin stories perform different work than intellectual genealogies, which trace the emergence of concepts from multiple traditions, or then analyze how different theoretical traditions treat the same concept differently. So I want to flag how intersectionality's origin stories circulate in at least 2 ways. So first, they respond to women's studies, quote unquote, and here I'm quoting Sirma Bilger, whitening of intersectionality by centering the analytic's origin in Black feminist studies. That is, these origin stories insist on intersectionality's presence in Black feminist theory, even before the term was coined, or they emphasize intersectionality's long roots in Black feminist scholarship and activism. In so doing, they underscore both the term's historical underpinnings and its fundamental connection to Black feminist scholarship. And second, origin stories function as debates internal to Black feminism about who coined the term, who its inaugural scholar is, or to put it bluntly, who owned it and who made it. So what origin stories share, despite their varied investments in intersectionality's original location, is an insistence on intersectionality's place in Black feminist thought, thus correcting the widely circulating notion that intersectionality is the intellectual contribution of women's studies. And here I think of Leslie McCall's paper, The Complexity of Intersectionality and Signs, which has a moment, it's so interesting that has been the subject of so much criticism that I cannot think that she would ever imagine would be the subject of so much criticism, which is when she describes intersectionality as the greatest contribution of feminist theory or of women's studies to related fields, right? And this line gets taken up as evidence of the ways in which feminist scholars generally and white feminist scholars in particular neglect, obscure, or elide the ways in which intersectionality is a Black feminist intellectual contribution. So these origin stories counter what Bilger calls the whitening of intersectionality. And one of the central ways that this whitening unfolds, according to Sirma Bilger, is through the now commonplace claim that intersectionality was in the air, that it was nascent in women's studies long before it was named. This claim to the analytic ignores, in Bilger's words, quote, the historical fact that intersectionality was developed by Black women activists and intellectuals against white-dominated feminism, as much as against the male-dominated Black liberation movement, against capitalism and heterosexism. The Black feminist response to this whitening is to assert as Jean-Alt Belkier does, that intersectionality is, quote, one of the greatest gifts of Black women's studies to social theory as a whole. In Belkier's account, intersectionality is not only a product of Black feminist theory, but also an indication of Black feminist generosity, since intersectionality is a crucially important gift, in her words, bestowed upon women's studies and related fields by Black feminists. For my purposes, what is fascinating about the response to women's studies' proprietary claims to intersectionality is Black feminist theory's own proprietary claims to the analytic. The subject of debate then becomes who truly owns intersectionality, who gets to claim the term as their property. While origin stories are at times a strategy for countering women's studies narratives about the analytic, they often produce their own sets of debates and contests among Black feminists. Indeed, Black feminists also consider intersectionality's histories among themselves, posing the question, who invented this term, often in disciplinarily specific ways. So Black feminist social scientists regularly perform intersectional origin stories through Patricia Hill Collins's work on the matrix of domination, while Black feminist humanists and legal scholars will still regularly cite Crenshaw. Still others, I think more common in the last few years, perform their origin stories through engagements with the historical underpinnings of intersectionality, emphasizing earlier intersectional innovators like the Combahee River Collective, Deborah King, Frances Beale, or Anna Julia Cooper. Oftentimes, these appeals to earlier Black feminist scholarship seek to locate intersectionality's arrival in a moment that predated the arrival of anti-essentialist feminism. Importantly, all these origin stories perform political work. They take complicated intellectual genealogies and reduce them to a singular story, engaging in corrective labor that rewrites circulating narratives about intersectionality. And I should say, I think another kind of debate about origin stories among Black feminists is whether intersectionality originates in the academy or in the streets. Among activists, Patricia Hill Collins's most recent work has really emphasized that intersectionality is an activist technology that comes into the academy rather than the reverse. And in a really fascinating moment at the Social Theory Forum in 2016, Patricia Hill Collins likens Kimberly Crenshaw to Christopher Columbus and says that she gets credit for intersectionality. In her words, she came back from the native lands from far, far away with the gift of intersectionality. Wow, she brought us a present. So there's some really interesting fighting happening within Black feminists around this question of ownership. My reading of these widely circulating, albeit disciplinarily specific, competing Black feminist origin stories presents a different account of debates over intersectionality's history than Robin Wiegman's work, which argues that Black feminist engagements with intersectionality break, in her quote, with the general habits of feminist citational practice, which routinely confer on the namer much more than citational status, and rarely posit a scholar's articulation of a term in the lower register than coinage infers. Wiegman suggests that Black feminist work on intersectionality refuses the lore of the signature in favor of a history of collective critical and political endeavor. The insistence on citing scholars before Crenshaw can be read as a radical refusal of the singular, a critical practice that relishes the collective. Yet I argue that Black feminist defensive work all too rarely refuses the lore of the signature, even as Black feminist scholarship is divided over whether the analytic originated with Crenshaw, Collins, Combahee, or Cooper. We are too often seduced by the narrative of singularity. And indeed, insisting on intersectionality's correct origins is a long-standing effort to carefully guard the analytic from abuse, to ensure that we tell correct stories about its history. So second, I want to say a little bit about the term appropriation. And this actually happened after I read the book, but in another moment at the Social Theory Forum, Patricia Hill Collins asks her audience, is intersectionality getting gentrified? And the audience cracks up, right? They think this is hilarious. And she continues and she says something like, I mean, it looks like the same intersectionality, but if you look closely, like, does it feel the same? Like, think of a neighborhood that you've been in that's been gentrified. When you're on the street, does it feel the same? And that was another analogy, much like somebody ran off with all of my stuff, that really resonated with the audience. So Black feminist scholars regularly mobilize language like gentrification, appropriation, commodification, and colonization to describe how intersectionality moves in troubling ways. In fact, the intersectionality wars are often waged through attempts to highlight and police these thefts. These scholars insist on reading the analytics movement across disciplinary boundaries as evidence of misuse and wrongful circulation. If intersectionality has been taken, or perhaps in the language of Black feminism, stolen, then the task of Black feminism is to expose the theft and to reclaim proper ownership of the analytic. So for example, Nicole Alexander Floyd writes, quote, "Barely a decade into the new millennium, a new wave of raced, gendered, occultic commodification is afoot, one focusing not on Black female subjectivity per se, but on the concept of intersectionality." Alexander Floyd's insights linking intersectionality circulation to a form of, quote, commodification are for me a point of departure for uncovering the feelings that intersectionality's institutionalization can engender. If intersectionality has been commodified, it is to suggest that the analytic, the result of intellectual labor, has been imbued with value, and that it has rendered a product for sale or for theft in the marketplace of ideas. While commodification is one rhetorical device through which defensiveness is ethically mobilized, colonization is another. The language of colonization positions intersectionality as a territory that has been wrongfully, problematically, and even violently taken by outsiders. Sirma Bilger writes, quote, "Intersectionality, originally focused on transformative knowledge production and radical politics of social justice, has been commodified and colonized for neoliberal regimes." Here, Bilger is engaged in an origin story. Intersectionality once was radical. It's been stripped of its political edge, and a story about wrongful possession. But she's also engaged in a story about theft, about the analytic taken by outsiders. In this act of colonization, she argues, intersectionality allows scholars who are not actually performing intersectional work to disguise their work in the guise of intersectionality, all the while maintaining the status quo. The language of colonization also points to the necessary decolonial labor of Black feminist theory. To return intersectionality to Black feminists and to Black women is to effectively undo longstanding practices of feminist colonialism, and thus is a practice of justice. Yet the seductive language of appropriation, commodification, and the like leaves at least two central questions unanswered. First, it's unclear how appropriation is different than the migration of theories. Intellectual ideas circulate, and of course, their circulation is made possible by structures that confer value on certain concepts and devalue others, by the institutional and geographic context in which ideas emerge. But this Black feminist work has yet to distinguish appropriation from the variety of uses to which any theory will be put by scholars of differing theoretical and political traditions. Second, where the scholarship succeeds is in its rigorous display that the capacity to call one's work intersectional is a claim to value. So at least on the US job market, you want to say that you are an intersectional scholar, right? That means you are a good scholar, a rigorous scholar, a complex scholar. However, Black feminism has yet to clearly reveal and then dismantle the system of value that aligns intersectional always with good feminist work, that presumes that intersectionality means politically virtuous. Instead, Black feminists reinvest in intersectionality's value by attempting to limit who can rightfully access the analytic. I want to say a little bit about the figure of the critic. So the remainder of my talk turns to the figure of the critic, who, as I mentioned, is represented as both ubiquitous and destructive, relentlessly attacking intersectionality in precisely the moment that the analytic has achieved visibility and interdisciplinary cachet. The critic, according to Black feminist scholarship, is marked by, in Vivian May's words, her cavalier treatment of intersectionality, by the production of work that is, quote, damaging to feminist anti-subordination scholarship and activism. The critic's work is destructive because it is apolitical. It's even violent. But as Vivian May suggests, critique has become all the rage. She writes, intersectionality critiques have become something of their own genre, a form so flourishing at times, it seems critique has become a primary means of taking up the concept and its literatures. Critique thrives then, she suggests, because of institutional politics that value dissent more than generative critical practice. Intersectionality's critics, she charges, are careerists. Rather than posing important questions about intersectionality and its limits, the critics' queries about intersectionality are figured as motivated by an unrelenting willingness to yield to the demands of the corporate university. Critique, then, is not only oppositional to intersectionality, but oppositional to the project of Black feminism more broadly, which is increasingly, in the context of the US university, oriented towards ethics of love, care, tenderness, vulnerability, mutuality. While Black feminists have carefully pointed out the ubiquity of critiques, there has been considerably less care in naming the critics who supposedly proffer and circulate these critiques. In an article in Science, for example, Barbara Tomlinson regularly names the critic, that's the term that she uses, describing the myriad forms of violent work the critic performs. Tomlinson says, for example, quote, "Critics may argue that intersectionality should be set free from the identities of the marginalized women of color who originated it. Critics may claim that intersectionality has not yet revealed as much as it ought to about identities, or has not examined the most important identities, one's own identity, enough identities, too many identities, or identities in a complex enough way." And she continues in that article to use this term, the critic, to describe a number of forms of intellectual work. So I want to sit with 2 moments in Tomlinson's description of the critic's varied labor. First, the ubiquity of the term critic. Critics are presumed to be monolithic in their labor. All critics, who are named only in clustered parenthetical citation in her text to collapse any distinction in their work, all perform the same intellectual and political work. Indeed, all critics seem to perform all of the labor that Tomlinson references, effectively undermining intersectionality and ensuring its vulnerability. Secondly, though critics are mentioned in parenthetical citation, it's often unclear how they perform the labor they're alleged to engage in, and which critics engage in which problematic practices. Instead, the reader encounters a cluster of names that conjures the ubiquity of all of the problematic work critics perform. Yet despite the contention that the critic is everywhere, that intersectionality is literally under siege, Black feminist texts that engage the problem of the critic share a lack of specificity about who this figure is. There is, though, one critic, in quotes, who is named repeatedly in Black feminist scholarship, Jasbir Puar. Puar is often figured in both scholarly and popular work as the paradigmatic critic of intersectionality. Anna Karastasis, for example, describes Puar's work as, quote, the most influential critique of intersectionality. Patrick Granka calls Puar one of intersectionality's most committed critics. And James Bliss notes that over the past decade, Jasbir Puar has offered a field-defining series of critiques of intersectionality. I attend to scholars' preoccupation with Puar as critic, not as part of a desire to rescue her from this title, but to interrogate what it means that her work has come to stand for a set of practices that undermine intersectionality, and to think about what it means that the critic, who is described as ubiquitous, omnipresent, and powerful, actually seems to be only one person. What is it, I ask, about Puar and Black feminist theory that has enabled the notion of Puar as the critic to circulate and to flourish? What role does Puar as paradigmatic critic play in enabling the intersectionality wars? For me, Puar's status in the Black feminist literature on intersectionality as the critic is particularly surprising because of her own uneasiness surrounding intersectionality and her desire to think anew about relationality in ways that intersectionality may not or may be able to accommodate. Indeed, as I often tell my students, it's crucial to read Puar's engagement with intersectionality twice. First in Terrorist Assemblages, which ends by setting assemblage, the analytic Puar champions against intersectionality. And then in her later work, I Would Rather Be a Cyborg Than a Goddess. I often say to my students, if you're lucky enough to have a life spent thinking, you will learn that you change your mind, which I think can be hard to imagine, right? That your opinions shift or evolve. So Puar writes in Terrorist Assemblages, quote, "As opposed to an intersectional model of identity, which presumes that components, race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, age, religion, are separable and can thus be disassembled, an assemblage is more attuned to interwoven forces that merge and dissipate time, space, and body against linearity, coherency, and permanency. She continues, and perhaps the most quoted portion of her work on intersectionality and terrorist assemblages, quote, as a tool of diversity management and a mantra of liberal multiculturalism, intersectionality colludes with the disciplinary apparatus of the state, census, demography, racial profiling, surveillance, in that difference is encased within a structural container that simply wishes the messiness of identity into a formulaic grid. Here, Puar offers her famous or infamous account of intersectionality that underscores its collusion or potential to collude with the state, the fact that it is or can be enmeshed with logics of counting, numeracy, measurement, and fixity. In a later article, I Would Rather Be a Cyborg Than a Goddess, though, Puar carefully traces her ambivalence about how intersectionality has come to be deployed in the space of women's studies. She writes, quote, but what the method of intersectionality is most predominantly used to qualify is the specific difference of women of color, a category that has now become simultaneously emptied of specific meaning on the one hand and overdetermined on the other. In this usage, intersectionality always produces an other. That other is always a woman of color who must invariably be shown to be resistant, subversive, or articulating a grievance. The critical question she poses about intersectionality here and its usages center on its dominance in women's studies, its place as the field's prevailing method, and the fact that questioning intersectionality results in precisely what has happened to Puar, the placement of the theorist and her frameworks as traitorous. In the second piece, what Puar performs is less what I would deem critique and more what I would describe as a critical inquiry surrounding intersectionality's circulation and institutionalization. Why then are Puar's ambivalent engagements with intersectionality's racial politics forgotten in the service of representing her work exclusively as damning critique? While my endeavor here can only be speculative, it is, at least to me, worth noting that one of intersectionality's only named critics, and the analytics imagined preeminent critic, is not Black and is often positioned as either a non-Black feminist or an anti-Black feminist, and sometimes as a queer theorist rather than a feminist. And we can think about the moments in which queer theory continues to be described as a theoretical project that's in friction with or even against feminist theory. My consideration of Puar's status as an outsider to Black feminism unfolds alongside how my own work gets described as critique. Our respective critical projects are differently described, circulated, and received in the field. While some of my earlier work, particularly my article Rethinking Intersectionality, is described as a critique of intersectionality, it's largely understood as emerging in and through an affection for Black feminism, a fact that might be tethered to my own scholarly work, but also to the ongoing collapses between racially marked subjects' bodies and their objects of study. When, for example, Brittany Cooper describes my work, she situates it as a Black feminist critique of intersectionality, one that, in her words, emerges from inside the imagined location where intersectionality was born. My location as Black feminist and as Black woman means that my critiques of intersectionality are imagined as practices of love and affection rather than hostility, and are thus treated with a kind of generosity. And I should say, and I'll just gesture to it here, there's a whole way in which Terrorist Assemblages, Jasbir Puar's first book, was described by some, to me, in a deeply problematic way as anti-Black, or as a text that had, as one scholar says, an anxious intent to sidestep Blackness. So there's this way in which she's been constructed, both in women's studies, but I think in allied fields, as an outsider to kind of Black studies and Black feminist projects. So if Puar's critiques are imagined to emerge from a non-location in Black feminism, she's also often positioned as an outsider to the feminist project itself, with her roots in queer theory underscored. Lynn Huffer, for example, notes that Puar, quote, shifts her focus away from feminist intersectionality to queer assemblage. It's interesting how intersectionality codes as feminist and assemblage as queer, right? And so Huffer says, in doing so, she directly challenges the unquestioned stability of the subject implicit in feminist intersectionality theory. Rather than reify an imagined distinction between feminist theory and queer theory, I instead want to ask how Puar's imagined location within queer theory amplifies the conception of her critique as formed by an outsider, and thus as a critique that makes intersectionality particularly and problematically vulnerable. In revealing that the critic is rarely named, and when she is so often puer, I seek to suggest that Black feminists produce the critic rather than expose it. Indeed, while the critic is regularly described by Black feminists as an omnipresent threat, she is actually one scholar who is relentlessly cast as an outsider to intersectionality and to Black feminist theory, a framing of her work that requires a refusal to engage her scholarship on intersectionality's institutional locations and racial politics. The figure of the critic is then an imaginative projection of Black feminist defensiveness, a figure that animates and justifies the defensive affect. The constant production of the threatening critic makes the labor of Black feminism abundantly clear to rescue Black feminist territory, to protect it from these outsiders who neither understand nor value the intellectual and political labor of Black feminism. So in closing, this talk began with my anxieties about being hailed as a critic, and it has unfolded as a rumination on the figure of the critic, an imaginative villainous projection, who I argue is central to the intersectionality wars, and thus animates the defensive territoriality that I term in the book holding on, the structure of feeling that I argue undergirds contemporary US Black feminism. The critic is the outsider, the hostile stranger who seeks to encroach on territory, on hard-earned intellectual turf that is not hers. But why would the practice of constructing the critic be so appealing to Black feminists? Why repeatedly produce this figure? Part of my contention is that the figure of the critic locks Black feminism into the logic of what Alison Pipemeyer terms besiegement. She has a beautiful essay where she talks about how much folks working in women's studies will narrate themselves as fighters and narrate women's studies itself as constantly besieged. She uses the term academic outlaws to describe how folks laboring in women's studies in the US describe themselves. And she'll ask, what does it mean to imagine yourself as an academic outlaw and to teach classes that regularly fail, to host numerous events on campus, to actually be partially and sometimes comfortably institutionalized? So following Pipemeyer's work, I ask how the figure of the critic and the narratives of besiegement it can produce is a deeply alluring one for Black feminism, particularly when the critic is imagined primarily as puer, a figure represented as outside the boundaries of Black feminism, and perhaps outside of the boundaries of feminism more broadly. The image of a vulnerable intersectionality, a literal space that needs to be protected from colonizers and gentrifiers, positions Black feminism as an ethical intervention that speaks on behalf of Black women in the service of protecting their intellectual labor. There is nothing more virtuous than protecting intersectionality from the critic. Yet this same alluring narrative locks Black feminism into a problematic location in women's studies, one that makes the theoretical tradition primarily oriented toward protecting its turf. I enter this debate, as I said, not merely as a scholar invested in Black feminist theory, but as one whose name is included in the list of critics. For me, this endeavor of thinking about who is the critic and what does the critic do has prompted a desire not to upend the category of the critic, but to spend more time with the villain in Black feminism's prevailing narrative, to sit with the imagined colonizer, appropriator, gentrifier, critic, and to ask, what is it that this figure might offer? How might Black feminists cultivate a conversation with the so-called critic, effectively seeing what she offers not as a threatening gesture, but as a kind of love letter, one that in Lauren Berlant's words offers us a chance to imagine becoming different. Part of the critic's offering is a rigorous engagement with the psychic structure of our tradition, a structure that has empowered us to locate danger everywhere. The critic's offering also includes compelling Black feminist theory to come to terms with our prevailing story about a dangerous outsider determined to undermine us, and offers us a chance to refuse the lure of territoriality. Instead, what might be possible if we, Black feminists, began to imagine new forms of agency and perhaps even embraced, rather than relentlessly rejecting, the vulnerability that intersectionality's movements can make some of us feel. Part of what the critic offers us is compelling a critical attention to how we, Black feminists, construct who is inside and outside the boundaries of our own tradition, pushing us to interrogate how our anti-captivity project has become its own boundary policing exercise. Ultimately, I argue what the critic sends us is not a threatening or world-ending message, but an invitation to embrace the possibility of other ways to be and feel Black feminist. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was incredible, rich, and full of new, ideas and thoughts, and a very dense speech. And I'm almost speechless at the moment because you raised so many questions that, and I think we could have a conversation for the next 2 hours about this, but we have limited time. One thing I want to say is that you may be interested in knowing that the critique of Sirma Bilge, she's critiquing, or as the starting point for the whitening of intersectionality, she uses the Frankfurt conference on intersectionality, which I have organized. So she has not been there. So that's somehow, when you were talking about this, of course, I was, reminded of a lot of critiques on this conference, which interestingly came from people who have not been there, but also from people who have been there. But in fact, I'm just I think this figure of the critic is so interesting that you brought up. Who is able to be a critic and who is supposed to be a critic? And I think it is very important what you said about this this idea about the commodification of intersectionality and or gentrification of intersectionality. Somehow, when I try to translate what you said to the German situation, I would say at our university, it's still the term diversity that is so important, not so much intersectionality. And so we have diversity politics, and one of the I think critical reactions to that is, and quite right so, is that difference is usually seen as something that is nice and it has to be managed, and intersectionality is being used for this kind of management. So in a way, I think there are a couple of aspects that are very that are quite right there. So and you have used that as well. I mean, you pointed out to them. And in that way, I think it's and I'm taking very serious this critique, also the critique of the question of whitening. On the other hand, I mean, there have been a lot of allegations, also other allegations coming from other parts of the feminist spectrum, like the allegation that intersectionality is an anti-Semitic ideology. I mean, we have heard that as well. So somehow it becomes like intersectionality becomes like this punch ball, which is gets these boxes from different sides. And I was just wondering what you would say. I mean, you were talking about the debate in the US, And but when I look at the debate in Germany or in other European countries, and every European country is different also, and see that the transatlantic traveling of the theory, of course, has been picked up in very different ways. I still think that there is a lot of this concept has a lot of potential, and I embrace it. But I think in the German context, it has been taken up more or less because the concept of race and racism is a very complicated concept in this country, and myself and other colleagues who have been working on racism and migration and the discrimination of minorities for a long time, for us, this concept was a gift in some way, because it somehow resonated much more than the concept of racism or the concept of Patricia Hill Collins' concept of the matrix of domination, because it didn't sound so how you call this, like an enemy word or something like that. It sounds different. And in this country where racism is a problem, but is still not really seen as a problem. I mean, this slowly this starts here, but I think this is why at least researchers doing research on racism has been picking up this concept so quickly. I was just wondering what you think about these, the different ways the concept is used and picked up.
Yeah, thank you for that. You said so much that's interesting, so I'm going to try to tackle much of what you said, and feel free to push me if I leave some things out. So, I mean, part of what I take you to say is that there is a elasticity to intersectionality that allows it to get put to work in a variety of kinds of ways, right? So in her famous feminist theory paper, Kathy Davis calls this the kind of intersectionality as buzzword, and wants to think of its amorphousness and ambiguity or flexibility as what's given it its capacity to travel, right? So I think there is a question to be asked about what is it about intersectionality that makes it a kind of shapeshifter that allows it to do so many different kinds of work, or even be mobilized in the service of projects that seem antithetical to intersectionality, right? So like I see diversity projects, which to me are about what Chandra Mohanty calls benign variation, right? Insert a few bodies into institutional space and keep going, right? I see intersectionality as a project that's not at all about the inclusion of a small number of bodies into a space that's otherwise unchanged. I see intersectionality as always pushing against these logics of inclusion and the fantasies that attach to them. And yet, as you suggest, diversity, which often travels in the US context with inclusion and sometimes with equity, also often travels with intersectionality. And so what does it mean? What does the marriage of these terms mean? And what does it mean that intersectionality can move with so many different folks? And I guess one of the ways I want to think about that question, and here's where one of my kind of issues with this idea of whitening is that I actually think in the context of the US, one of the ways that intersectionality in the space of the university moves from the women's studies classroom to the dean's office to the provost strategic plan, that actually some of that work happens on the backs of Black women who move into the managerial positions in the space of the university, often through these diversity initiatives, right? Through their work as diversity deans or equity deans, right? And who bring this language and set of commitments with them, and it gets translated or remade in ways that seem unfamiliar or even troubling. I think that sometimes the language of whitening can make it seem that can hide, right, the ways in which Black women, and women in particular, Black women in the context of the US Academy, get called upon, conscripted into, seduced by this diversity work. The other piece about the whitening language for me is this question that it implies that intersectionality is not a mode of analysis, but a tool that both describes particular bodies and should be used only by certain scholars to describe particular bodies, right? So if we think of intersectionality as being whitened, to me, it suggests like, what does it mean? Was it blackened before, right? How did it get whitened? Is its whitened status by who's using it or what it's being used to study? If it is a Black analytic, what does that mean? And I ask these questions because, in the context of Black studies, at least in the US, there is increasingly this real, in my mind, correct critique of the ways in which innovations by Black scholars generally, but by Black women in particular, are never thought of as being able to make universal claims. They're always already thought to be claims that could only be applicable to describing Black folks, right? And so we suddenly have intersectionality in this moment where it's being mobilized to describe all kinds of people and bodies. And then there's this anxiety about the fact that it's not being used to describe Black women, right? And so there's a kind of interesting dance there where there's this desire for theories produced by Black scholars to be able to speak to the universal, right? And also this sense that that's a kind of violence. And so I want to think about how to negotiate that with a greater sense of care. I'm curious, and perhaps you and I can talk more about this, about the kind of promise that intersectionality has rhetorically, or had for you rhetorically, that something like Matrix of Domination doesn't, because I do think there is this move increasingly in the context of the US Academy to actually double down on Matrix of Domination and to find it appealing again. I think in part because for some, Matrix of Domination is thought to be a way of describing how power arranges bodies and how power arranges vulnerabilities, and not as a way of describing identity. I personally don't think that you can separate identity and how power arranges bodies as neatly as I just suggested in that previous sentence, but I think there is this sense of like, okay, Matrix of Domination helps us think about social structure and how vulnerabilities are allocated in social structure. And it calls attention to that in a way that intersectionality does not. For those of you who taught Crenshaw, at least in the context of the US university, there's always this moment where a student will describe a person as intersectional, right? And not a location or a set of structures coming together. And I think for some folks, Matrix of Domination helps circumvent that. And I guess just two other thoughts, based on what you said, you gestured to thinking about the transnational sort of movement, circulation of intersectionality, which is of increasing interest to me. So I have a baby project, it's not yet fully formed, a baby project that's thinking about how intersectionality is getting mobilized in the context of India and feminist activism there, and what it means, for example, that Dalit feminists are organizing with Crenshaw as a kind of foundational text, right? And so I'm very curious about intersectionality's movements. And in the context of the US Academy, I've never heard anyone describe that as the whitening of intersectionality, right? So that's also interesting to me as we sort of think about what precisely whitening means or doesn't mean. And I will say, just as a shout out, you mentioned, Hamma, this notion of the ways in which intersectionality has been shockingly described as a kind of anti-Semitic ideology. It's interesting you name that because that's another site where Puar's name circulates, at least in the US. So she's attached to, she's imagined to be attached to both anti-Semitism and this kind of anti-intersectionality. So it's an odd dance. She's actually writing a piece that's supposed to come out later this year on this question of how intersectionality has come to be described as anti-Semitic. So I'm very curious to see where that piece goes, because I think that conversation, at least in the US, has largely unfolded outside of the university and has tremendous power. And so I'm curious to see how she takes it up. So hopefully that gets at some of the questions that you posed, and thank you for those.
Thanks a lot. I have many more, but but there are others who want to ask questions to Marianne.
Yes, yes, I also have a lot of questions, and thank you very much for this rich and dense lecture. I'm interested in the relationship between women's and gender studies and intersectionality as you describe it. And because on the one hand, I think the situation is different between US and Germany. I could describe the situation of women's and gender studies in Germany also as in defense, yes, with effects of defensiveness. So it's kind of a double defensiveness. Yes, it's yes, negotiations and thinking about Black feminism in gender and women's studies, and to acknowledge the autonomous theoretical standpoints. But gender studies in Germany, they are not really in this place like in US. And we, in Germany, there's also a split between diversity politics in universities and gender studies research in universities. So they are differently funded, and yes, they address different problems. So I'm very much interested in your vision, how gender, women's studies, Black feminist theory, how is, I guess, a way to work together, to yes, to act in solidarity, and to bring forward critical standpoints reflecting our yes, our ideas, theories, our and different experiences. How can we bring them to the fore in the academy? So
Thank you for that. It's a great question. And as you were talking, I mean, one of the experiences I had before the book was out, when I would be invited to women's studies departments or programs in the US to talk about women's studies, is there was a sense of the tremendous heterogeneity of the institutional project of women's studies in the context of the US, right? So private versus public. In the US, our kind of categorization of R1, so major research institutions versus R2s and R3s, which are more teaching intensive. And then, I mean, one of the ways in which COVID-19 has reshaped the university, which has been particularly in public universities, with kind of austerity measures, the capacity of public universities to gut programs or departments that they've wanted to gut for a long time or that they've deemed as not essential, which often includes Black studies, Latinx studies, Asian American studies, and women and gender studies. So I mean, there's a lot happening. There's a lot more variety, right, even in the U.S. in the picture of what women's studies is in its relationship to intersectionality. So I suppose I want to do a few things. Like one is, and here I'm really informed by Claire Hemmings' book, Why Stories Matter. I want to think about how in academic feminism we tell stories about academic feminism, right? And I think, and Hemmings for me really does this so beautifully, which is to argue that two of the three narratives that she argues we traffic in all the time, one is progress and the other is loss, hinge on Black feminism generally and intersectionality specifically. The progress narrative essentially being once upon a time we were all essentialists and we believed in women, and then Black feminism happened, particularly intersectionality, and now we believe in multiplicity, right? And we teach differently and we think differently. Or she argues we have the flip, which I think in the context of the US, you particularly see in spaces of political feminism, right? Like, so this was the anxiety about the Women's March. Once upon a time, we were all women, then Black feminists came along, they insisted on difference, and we haven't been able to unify ever since, right? And I think women's studies in the US traffics in both of those narratives, progress and loss simultaneously, but what they share is that Black feminism, generally intersectionality specifically, is cast as an intervention that happened in a particular moment that fundamentally transformed or remade our field, whether in the sense of pushing us towards a utopian future or essentially undermining our capacity to ever speak about anything ever, right? Because we can't say woman, we can't say, right? Like, so in both of those, Black feminism is a kind of key turning point in intervention, in interruption, not a tradition, but an interruption, right? So I want to think through that as I think through, to your broad question, like the relationship between women's studies and intersectionality. And also, I want to think about a moment in the context of the US university where we are supposed to be churning out particular kinds of future worker citizen consumers who are prepared for the diverse and global workforce, who are intersectionally trained, right, to think about a new America and to think about how we in women's studies in the US have spoken that language back to our administration. Like, hey, you want folks to train the next generation of global citizens who can think about race, gender, class, and nation simultaneously, who can do study abroad programs where they think about the plight of women in other countries. What better space than women's studies to train folks to do that, right? So there's this way in which, and I say this as someone who's chaired a women's studies program and has had to speak this language, we mobilize the language of intersectionality as the thing we do differently, exceptionally better, right? As a way we can train our students. And we use that as a way to garner resources and to argue for our importance in a university that, at least in the context of the US, prior to, I think, the 2000s, really saw us as expendable, as like a mom and pop endeavor, right? Like when I think of what women's studies was when I got to college, it was 3 or 4 women who didn't have lines in women's studies, but who through a labor of love and essentially working double duty, right, were running these courses, which is very different than what women's studies looks like at, say, an institution like Duke now, where we have 9 tenure lines and our classes are filled to capacity, right? And in part, that's because student demand has changed and the university's desire to compose and curate a certain kind of aesthetic of who constitutes its undergraduates has changed, right? But some of it is because we've become really good at how to speak a certain kind of corporate language to signal that what we offer is as good as what the economics department offers in teaching students to be certain kinds of global thinkers, right? And so I am very interested in the moments, I don't write about it as much in the book, but I'm very interested in the moments in which we, within this field, speak or adopt the language of the university bureaucracy to argue for resources, right? And that's the piece that I gesture to at the end of the talk. And this might be a key difference, I'm curious to hear more, between the place of women's studies in the US Academy and in Germany. But if a project that I joined in 1997 as an undergraduate felt precarious, it does not feel precarious anymore. I mean, when I was an undergraduate major at Harvard University, as an incredibly resourced institution, I think those of us who are women's studies majors felt like the department could close at any moment. Like that's how precarious it felt, right? I have not worked at an institution, and granted, I've worked at private institutions, well-resourced institutions, but the question of whether the discipline would survive at the institution has never been a question, right? So something significant has shifted. And the account that I'm offering in my book is actually that making an argument for intersectionality as one of the things that we do differently is part of that story. The other part of that story, which I gesture to in the book, but don't write that much about, but I think there was a moment when transnationalism was part of that story as well, when one of the claims that women's studies could make was that we train students in this kind of US and the world, global visions, in a way that economics or philosophy simply wasn't training students. There's a beautiful essay by Shirin Roshan Ravan trying to think about the growth of study abroad programs that actually are training students in feminist transnational theory and transnational studies, and right that we have this whole way of cultivating the minds of these sort of globally minded students, and that's actually become a critical vocabulary that women's studies has mobilized. So for me, transnationalism and intersectionality are not outside of the story of women's studies. I think partial institutionalization, right? Always uncomfortable institutionalization. And I guess the last piece, and I'm trying to gesture to this in the book in relationship to Black feminists, is I'm really interested not in an account of our powerlessness, but in an account of the power we've accrued, which is an uncomfortable conversation, right? Like to get Black feminists in a room and to be like, let's talk about the power we wield. It is uncomfortable, but I actually think it's honest because to me, Black feminist theory in the context of the US while still often taught in US universities as an intervention, a correction, an interruption. If you look at the US academic job market, the last 5 years in women's studies, the vast majority of jobs have been in Black feminist theory, women of color feminism. So there is a way in which we have managed to accrue a certain amount of power. And it is up to us to decide how we will wield that power, right? And I think we have all sorts of models for how power is wielded in violent ways. So the question becomes, well, what are the more equitable, more caring, more tender ways of to mobilize power that we want to imagine? But that's why I end with Alison Pipemeyer's kind of narrative of besiegement and how alluring it is, because it is this narrative of like, we are the underdog and we have nothing, is a really alluring narrative. And yet I don't think it anymore captures the state of the field, nor do I think it captures the state of Black feminist theory in the field. So that's some of what I'm trying to get at. In the context of the book, I try to take great care to note that I'm interested in a set of trends in the US Academy. And I think as I wrote that, I was aware of the fact that there is a sort of, I don't know if sequel is the right word, there's another version of this book that begs to be written about, as I said in conversation with Helma, about the movement of intersectionality beyond the US, right? Both in women's studies departments and programs outside of US universities and in the political life of feminism in non-US locations. And so that's something I'm going to continue to think through.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Lucas, would you like to do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you.
Is it okay with you, Jennifer? One more question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, first, Jennifer, thank you also for your wonderful talk. It was a lot of issues to connect, also to think about. Yeah, a lot of the questions that I wanted to ask were already asked or were discussed now, so I think it's a very good sign. I was very interested in the term of intersectionality in a bureaucratic context, as Helma also said here, more diversity is more common. And yeah, I was wondering about the relationship between them and why maybe in some contexts intersectionality is chosen over diversity, or is it complementary in a way? And why is it? And then maybe connected to that, you also criticized terms that were used in connection to the usage or mal-usage of intersectionality, like colonization or anything. What term would you think would be appropriate for this kind of, is it commodification or maybe like in the neoliberalization? Yeah, those were also in connection to poor, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. I appreciate those questions. To your first question about sort of the bureaucratic language of intersectionality, one of the things that occurred to me to mention is that in the context of both the US Academy, feminist work in the US Academy and feminist work outside of the US Academy, there is this way in which intersectionality has come to be a metric and a way in which resources are allocated. So let me say a little bit more about that. So when I say a metric, this is something that's fascinating to me. Like if I'm asked to be a peer reviewer for a US feminist scholarly journal, it's increasingly the case. You know, you're asked a few open-ended questions. What suggestions do you want to give this author? But often there'll be this kind of 1 to 5 scales, particularly if you're evaluating a piece for, say, a journal in the social sciences. And I've seen from more than one journal that I'm supposed to measure a piece by how intersectional it is on a scale of 1 to 5, right? I find that to be a fascinating question. I find it to be, and I also find it to be a fascinating idea that I could tell an author, as you revise this manuscript, like, why don't you bump up the intersectionality or like add some more, right? So like here, intersectionality is not a mode of inquiry or a mode of analysis, right? It's unclear to me what it means there, but I know that it can be measured, right? And that there can be more or less of it. And I think for my purposes, that more of it makes something better, right? And that's sort of part of where, when I started this project, I wanted to think through that, like, how is it that intersectionality came to mean good, right, ethical? So that pretty much every graduate student I work with will say that their project is intersectional because that means good and complex and rigorous and nuanced and right. And nobody's ever going to say, why are you taking an intersectional approach? Like, why would you do that, right? Because you should take an intersectional approach, right? So So there's that question of metrics. But then I also think I have a former student who now teaches at Brandeis, V. Chowdhury, who wrote a dissertation thinking about NGOs that fund trans rights efforts. And one of the ways that these NGOs were also measuring which organizations or efforts they should fund was around this question of, is the effort intersectional? Again, 1 to 5, how intersectional is it? And this would become a very contentious question. But one of the things that V argues in their dissertation is that how intersectional is this organization almost always meant, is a Black woman involved? And more particularly, is a Black woman involved in a position of leadership? And if the answer was yes, it meant that the effort itself was intersectional and thus worthy of funding. So there are these interesting collapses happening, which I try to track in my talk, but there's also something really interesting to your term about the bureaucratization of intersectionality. There's something really interesting happening around measurement, assessment, counting, which again seems to be one of those moments to me that's antithetical to the project of intersectionality, right? These ideas of measurement, counting, breaking down identities into discrete categories, or even just the fetishization of Black women, right? Where if an effort is led by a Black woman, it is in and of itself intersectional. So that's some of what comes to mind when you mention the bureaucratic nature of intersectionality. Second, this kind of like, I always call it like the word soup, the neologism word soup around diversity and equity and inclusion and intersectionality. It's funny because, one of the things that I often think as I try to map this is that there is a way in which, at least in my gut reaction, is that sort of diversity was like a first generation term in the context of the US university for describing a project that was about inclusion, right? So a diversity effort was about inserting different kinds of bodies into the space of the university. What I take intersectionality to be doing when it's invoked in the context of, say, the bureaucracy of the US university is both about adding different bodies to the mix, but also thinking about structures of power. Now, I don't think that often happens, but I think that's what's gestured to in its naming. I think there is much more work to be done about the particular histories of each of these terms. Like one of the things that happened in the US this summer after the murder of George Floyd was that every institution that you can think of issued a statement, from like Amazon.com to Ben & Jerry's ice cream to Duke University, issued a statement about George Floyd and offered this kind of like list of terms: diversity, inclusion, equity, intersectionality. And so I think there's more work to be done. Sarah Ahmed starts this in On Being Included. Rod Ferguson does some of it in his work, but like tracing the specific and distinct genealogies of these terms and then how they come to be rendered synonymous. To your last question, I always describe, when I talk about intersectionality, I don't tend to use terms like commodification. I tend to say that for me, part of what fascinates me about this term and the reason I've devoted so much time to it is because it moves in a way that no other term I can think of in the context of feminism has moved. And it moves across every border that I can think of that usually feels entrenched, right? It moves across theory, politics, and practice. It moves across faculty and university administration. And to me, and this is fascinating, I don't think many people write about it, it's a term that at least partially comes of age in the US Legal Academy, one of the most traditional sites in the US Academy, and moves into the humanities and social sciences, so much so that in the context of the US Legal Academy, there are very few people continuing to write about intersectionality. It is not a lively site of feminist debate in the US Legal Academy, right? In fact, when I've gone to speak at law conferences, they're like, why are you still talking about this, right? And so there's something really interesting even about the fact that it moves from law to being a term that folks in history or sociology are using. So it's that movement that I try to think about, like, what is it that has allowed this term to spread? Who's done that spreading? How has it continued to shapeshift as it spread in different contexts? And it's funny, sometimes I'll think to myself, like, what are other ideas or terms that have had this kind of life? I think to myself, something like Judith Butler's idea of performance, right? Like that's, Judith Butler was on the cover of New York Magazine 2 years ago saying gender is a performance. Now everybody thinks this. And yet there's something different about intersectionality in terms of like its broad audience, right? One of the things, just in closing, that I often say to my students, undergraduates, when we encounter Kimberly Crenshaw's work is, this is probably the one text we'll read this semester where you all already know this term and you've never read this article. right? Like, and that's a fascinating paradox to me, right? They've all heard the term, almost all of them encountered it in high school, which is fascinating. But they've never heard of Crenshaw and they've never read these pieces. So there's this way in which the term has almost saturated popular culture. In another version of this talk, I have a whole thing that I do about intersectionality appearing on tote bags and coffee mugs and how it's become something you can wear, right? And that's part of how it's traveled. So all this to say, I'm interested in its movement and the velocity of its movement. I'm curious about, will that velocity continue, right? Or what might change or impede its velocity. So I hope that gets at your questions, and thank you for them.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating, and really, I mean, we could go on, but this is exhausting as well. You must be exhausted. Thanks so much for bearing with us with our questions.